Out of my experience learning and working in the animation industry, there's no doubt that lines play a vital role in your drawing skills. Feeling insecure about your lines? Let's talk about some practices that you can do to help improve that confidence and control for your lines. Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and today I'd like to talk about tips and practices that you guys can do in order to build confidence in your line strokes when you draw. So I'm a really sketchy person naturally. I don't make one single stroke for one single line, I make multiple strokes. But then as someone who works in animation, I have to clean up my animation, and sometimes I need my lines to be more bold and decisive. The same thing goes with storyboarding. You need to be able to have clear drawings with just a few strokes, since we work super fast and we have to form a shorthand that is pretty clear. Example artists that I can think of that have decisive lines are artists like Alex Toth, who did designs for Hanna-Barbera cartoons such as Johnny Quest back in the day. Even though the drawings aren't super detailed and are quite graphic, you can tell that the line strokes are quite decisive, and you can tell there's clear draftsmanship skills behind each drawing. Another artist that I can think of is Bastien Vives, whose drawings have a lot of life. There's some clear observation skills being used here, and that the shape language is quite decisive. Chris Palmer has a great sensibilities when it comes to lines too. Very decisive, clear shapes. The drawings don't feel overworked. When it comes to storyboarding, for example, Ki-hyun Ryu uses an economic shorthand that still reads as high detailed anatomy. And then there's Kim Jung-gi, whose work is very detailed by the way, and very intricate, but if you watch his videos of his process, all his strokes are really decisive, and there's a clear confidence whenever he puts down those strokes. And there's many other artists that I can think of are great examples when it comes to line confidence and boldness. Now for these practices, I want you guys to get into the habit of avoiding certain habits, such as avoiding scratchy lines when you draw. Having scratchy lines means that you're repeatedly making little strokes just to complete a line. Try and complete one line with one single stroke. Remember, you want to be bold and confident. Sometimes scratchy lines can read as someone who is indecisive or insecure about their choices. Now, I don't think overly sketchy or super scratchy lines is a bad thing, and especially if you are someone who is twitchy or shaky with your hand, but I think it is a good practice to just make single strokes, leave it as it is, and live with it. Now, the second thing I want you guys to try and avoid is to avoid utilizing transformation tools after you make your strokes. And this is a common practice for today's artists, and honestly, it's not a bad thing either. But remember, you want to build that mileage and confidence when you start drawing, and think of it as drawing on paper if you are working completely digitally. Try not to draw your lines and strokes and then just try and manipulate them with the lasso tool and some transformation tools digitally. Now, if you're not happy with the strokes that you make, just erase it manually by hand and then just try and redraw those strokes. If not, don't erase them and just live with the strokes that you make. Basically, live with your decisions. Now, there's other things that I wouldn't try and do, which is like rendering or shading, or even try to construct the drawing first with building blocks first. Remember, if we want to get into the habit of making bold and confident line strokes, we have to sort of force ourselves to target that practice. But that doesn't mean those other practices are wrong. It's like working out, we just need to target a certain muscle. Alright, so the first practice that I would recommend you doing is a negative space drawing with just lines. So what does that mean, and what is negative space? The way I would describe it is that it is that space or shape surrounding the subject or object. Or another way that you can think about it is just by drawing the silhouette of your subject. And if you're doing this practice, I would recommend you guys to just try and do it slow and just guide your pencil or your drawing instrument while looking and analyzing at your subject. And I really want you to force yourself to just look at the negative spaces, not the subject by itself, but more about the shape that the subject and the negative space around them is forming, and really just try and focus on those shapes. Now, when you're doing these drawings, you're going to fall into the habit of trying to draw inside the shapes, trying to define the hand, trying to define eyes or cloth wrinkles, but you want to do your best to avoid those for now, and just treat it as these abstract shapes. A practice like this is going to build hand-to-eye coordination, but it's also going to help you observe more, meaning that you're forcing yourself to observe things in a different manner than trying to break things as the literal, like you're not trying to define the eyes, the nose, or very specific parts. You're just focusing and trying to force yourself to observe the shapes that it is forming. And that's the key word, observation. Like you're going to come up with lines and shapes that are going to resemble cloth or resemble hair or cloth being affected by gravity and wind. And you want to be able to spot those when you are drawing so you can actually apply that visual library into your own figure invention or drawing in the future, or when you're actually animating characters or doing any drawing related stuff. And again, I want you guys to treat this slow. I sped up my video just for the sake of the video, but I would spend as long as you can in each of these lines. And just try making long, slow strokes. Don't try to lift the pencil or tablet pen off the surface. Just try your best to do less of that. Now, the second practice that is pretty important for observation skills when it comes to drawing is contour drawing. And a few times I've talked about blind contour drawing, and it's when you're just drawing the figure, looking at your subject only without looking at your actual drawing while you are drawing. And this is to build hand-to-eye coordination as well as to force observation skill. Now, the same thing can be applied here, but now you can have the freedom to look at your drawing while you are practicing this contour drawing. Now, the challenge for this is that you can't really define shades or anything like that, but you can use lines to describe the form of your subject. So if you see like a shift in the planar language on the human face or a shape of their cloth, if you see some shadows, just try and capture that shape. Draw around that shape. The same thing goes if you see nice shapes describing light, and again, describing shadows. Just try to capture and just draw that shape. The line by itself can be incredibly powerful, and it can describe form of your subject. You don't need shadow information. You don't need to render your drawings. You can just use lines to describe that planar information of your subjects. Again, this is just to practice hand-to-eye coordination. It's also to practice your strokes, and it's also there to utilize how you can be creative or bold with your strokes. How can you use those strokes to get more clarity or more information of your subjects? Now imagine if you had to color and shade your characters in the cell shading manner. You have to choose shapes and line information that best describes the form so you know where to apply the darker or lighter colors for your characters. But more so, this is an observation and line stroke mileage practice. Now your hand must be hurting right now. It's twitching, it's achy, you had to draw really slow and really carefully, and your hand just probably sucks right now, but that's okay. Now the next practice that I'd like you guys to try is loose gesture drawing, but using only contour. And for this practice, I would say screw proportions, screw solid drawing. Just look at your subject and draw as fast as you can without being overly sketchy and just being bold and confident with your strokes. And again, I want you guys to try and go as fast as you can with these. Now, not only is this going to build hand-to-eye coordination and some observation skills, but it's going to loosen you up and it's going to be more bold and brave when you do draw. So imagine if you're storyboarding or animating or illustrating and you just want to get the idea across really quickly and just complete the gesture as fast as you can. Without having to resort to academic drawing skills yet, you can just do a pass like this at first to just nail the idea down, get that loose gestural energy on your drawings first, and use it as the foundation for your drawing. And if you're just going pretty fast and gesturally, you're going to push those drawings into crazy places. Like you're going to exaggerate proportions, you're going to exaggerate the gesture. But again, it's also learning to trust your lines and to be okay with being loose. Remember, the point of being confident with your lines is also being unafraid to make mistakes all the time. And sometimes you can have pleasant surprises when you don't have full control over these things. Now, another practice that I would recommend you guys try and do is bold limited strokes. So if you're drawing subjects like figure drawing or anything like that, try and draw the subject in less than 10 strokes of lines. And this is going to teach you how to prioritize or emphasize certain parts of the drawing. And something like this is super useful and crucial when it comes to storyboarding. You don't have enough time to try and board every single drawing as crisp as possible. And nowadays, boards are becoming more animated, as much as I personally don't like that, but that's the case. So for this practice, really captures the overall idea. So what I usually do is I try and capture the silhouette first, and then I try and draw parts that are pretty crucial to the drawing. I look at things like clarity, I look at things that indicate a bit of storytelling. Sometimes I don't describe the whole figure. Sometimes I can only describe an overall shape that the figure kind of has and then just indicate parts that kind of give a hint of what that figure is doing. So this is where we kind of get into graphic design territory. And the way I would describe graphic design or design is all about emphasizing certain elements, prioritizing certain elements, and subduing parts that might be too distracted from the main idea. This can also mean iconizing something, so when you see something that is very simple, there's enough information that kind of give clarity to what this figure is doing. And having that graphic sensibility where you can have clear storytelling in just a few strokes is crucial when it comes to drawing for animation. But it's also to show how bold, limited strokes can actually add a lot to your drawings. Sometimes less is enough, or in many cases, less is more. So try completing your figures in less than 10 strokes as a practice to get that boldness in your lines, as well as the graphic sensibilities that lines can do. And if you have been wanting to get better at that understanding of straights versus curves for lines, you can practice that here too, where to emphasize those straights and where to emphasize those curves. A few storyboarding mentors would make their students draw their storyboards using a Sharpie, and therefore when you make a stroke, you have to work with it. Now, the second bold strokes practice that I want you to practice is to try and break down the body parts. So I like to think of the arms or limbs as a separate body part and the whole torso as a whole body part. And I would just try and capture each body part with 6 strokes or less. You can do a triangle if you want, you can do squares. One thing that I would do is if you are drawing a figure from reference, try and find the shapes in those figures and try to use simplistic shapes to try and capture the overall idea of that figure. Think about things like tapering, for example. It's the idea of things becoming thinner or smaller as it goes towards the end. An example for this is when I draw a shape that resembles the arm, it starts thick at the shoulder, but the width of that shape starts to shrink as it gets closer to the hand. A lot of interesting and dynamic shapes have this sense of tapering, and you will notice it a lot in human figure shapes. Several things that this practice can teach you. One is just being able to be more decisive and bold with your strokes, and 2 is also to learn how to break things down into more simpler shapes. So if we're looking at the figure, for example, and we want to define the limbs, the torso, and the arm, a great challenge to get a grasp on is to be able to break down those limbs or those torsos into its own graphic simple shapes. Now, the first practice of bold strokes was all about just trying to capture the overall idea with just a few strokes. Now it's also knowing and making decisions on how to simplify certain body parts or anatomy or anything into more simpler shapes. How to break down complex forms into just a resemblance of just a few strokes or shapes. Something like this is useful if you are doing shorthands for storyboarding or even character design, especially when you have to try and think of really bold shapes for your character designs so they're recognizable and also it helps you recreate them. Now, the next practice for this bold strokes exercise is to be able to break them down into more complex shapes. So let's say in the previous bold strokes practice, it was all about trying to break down each body part as just one shape. Now, divide that by 2. So now, for example, if you were trying to draw the arm as one single shape, now there are 2 different shapes. One describing the forearm, one describing the upper arm. The same thing with the leg. Maybe one shape described the leg, now you can try and describe the upper leg and the lower leg. Same with the torso. Divide that by 2. And now you can draw the chest as its own thing and the butt and pelvis as its own separate thing. And from here on, you can start breaking things down into more simpler shapes as their own entity. And it's really just an exercise of knowing what shapes to use, how to break them down, and how to simplify those shapes. And again, I want you guys to be more controlled with your lines. When you make a line, just be bold, be decisive, make that stroke and leave it as it is. And when you want to make a new stroke, just make a new stroke again, leave it as it is, and keep doing the same thing as you move on. Now, if you're someone who likes to be scratchy or sketchy, like me for example, this is a real challenge and it's kind of forcing you to rewire a lot of habits that you might have. And I feel like those are the practices that I could talk about that can help you get more confident and bolder with your lines. And now, you can start experimenting with it. Maybe you can start mixing it up. Maybe you can draw the silhouette or the negative space first and then implement and add in information with your line strokes. Maybe you want to capture the overall idea in less than 10 strokes, and then afterwards you can go on top of it and then try and define more specific while using the first pass as sort of a foundation. Maybe you want to break down each anatomy as its own shape. So let's say you have lighting information or planar information that you'd like to dictate. How can you describe that using lines only? Are you going to draw the shadows in? Are you going to draw the highlights or the lights on the subject? If you just wanted to use lines only to describe the cloth folds or the hair folds or anything with crease, try it. And you want to be decisive with your stroke. So when you make a stroke, try and just live with it. Try and just work with it. You can go back and erase it, but one thing that can also help is just to leave it as it is and just move forward, because sometimes you learn from those mistakes, or the more you keep doing it and the less you try to fix it, is just going to build more of that confidence for your lines. If being confident and bold with your lines is your weakness, you really have to force yourself to just work on that muscle. This is just one way in how you can build confidence and boldness and decisive lines when you actually put your line strokes. And of course, it's not the only way. Now, in my previous videos, I talked about working things slow, drawing through things, how to approach things more academically, how to think about things more constructively. And of course, those are things that you should look up to. Study anatomy, study technical drawing, study observation, and study your inspirations. And it's not just looking for artists who have good line quality or good decisive lines, but also look at artists that you admire and try to understand why their work resonates well with you, and figure out exercises so you can get closer to that skill level. And of course, experiment and break out of your comfort zone. Anyways, that's all I'm going to talk about. Bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.